Welcome. Tonight we step away from the glow of modern screens and drift into a quieter world, a world without electricity, without instant entertainment, without endless distraction. Today we journey back to the year 1850, into Victorian streets lit by gaslight, into homes warmed by candle flame, and into a time when fun was not switched on but carefully created. This is a world where laughter echoed in music halls, where stories were told aloud, where streets themselves became stages, and where joy depended not on machines, but on human presence. As we drift into this past, listen closely, not just to what they did for fun, but to what their way of living reveals about time, patience, and connection. This is not a story about what they lacked. It's a story about what they understood. Let us begin. Imagine a world where the simple act of turning on a light did not exist. A world where night arrived, not with a switch, but with a slow surrender of the sun, and with it, a profound change in how people lived, spoke, and entertained themselves. In 1850, the Victorian world operated at the mercy of daylight. When evening fell, it was not conquered. It was respected. Darkness shaped human behavior, slowing life down and forcing people inward, toward each other, toward conversation, toward imagination. In this era, time felt heavier. Days were not fragmented by constant alerts or endless distractions. Instead, they moved with a rhythm dictated by nature. Morning began early, not because of alarm clocks, but because sunlight demanded it. Evening arrived gradually, bringing silence, reflection, and a different kind of awareness. Without electricity, there was no illusion that night could be ignored. When darkness came, people adapted rather than resisted. Entertainment, therefore, was not something instantly available. It required intention. Fun had to be planned, prepared for, and often earned. This alone gave it weight. A night of amusement was not casually wasted because arranging it required effort. Lighting candles, cleaning rooms, dressing properly, and gathering people together. Leisure was an occasion, not a background noise. Victorians lived surrounded by silence in a way modern people rarely experience. There was no hum of electronics, no glowing screens filling every corner of the room. Silence was broken only by human voices, footsteps, the crackle of fire, or the distant sounds of horses and carts outside. This silence made people more attentive. They listened more closely, not just to others, but to themselves. When the sun dipped below the horizon, gas lamps flickered to life in wealthier streets, while candles were lit carefully in homes. Lighting a room was an act, not an afterthought. Candles were expensive and finite, so they were used thoughtfully. Shadows stretched across walls, making rooms feel alive. Faces glowed warmly in low light, expressions more dramatic, emotions more visible. In this atmosphere, storytelling flourished. Conversation became the backbone of social life. Without screens to retreat into, people faced one another fully. They talked, not in short bursts, but in long, winding discussions that moved from daily gossip to philosophy, politics, religion, and personal reflection. Silence was not awkward, it was a pause for thought. Words mattered because they were the primary form of stimulation. Children grew up learning how to entertain themselves without devices. Their imaginations were trained early, shaped by observation and invention rather than consumption. They created games from scraps, told stories, mimicked adults, and learned patience through waiting. Boredom was not immediately eliminated, it was endured, and in enduring it, creativity was born. The absence of electricity also meant that night carried a certain mystery. Darkness was not fully banished. It lingered at the edges of vision. This gave rise to superstition, storytelling, and a heightened sense of the unseen. Ghost stories, moral tales, and cautionary legends thrived in candlelit rooms where shadows seemed to move on their own. Entertainment often blurred into education, warning, and moral instruction. Victorian society placed immense value on routine and order, but leisure existed as a necessary release from that structure. Workdays were long and physically demanding, especially for the working class. This made moments of rest deeply meaningful. Fun was not taken lightly because it stood in contrast to hardship. Laughter was louder because life was harder. Even the concept of free time was different. There was no expectation that every spare moment must be filled. Waiting was normal. Slowness was accepted. People watched the world instead of rushing through it. They observed weather, human behavior, and small details of daily life. This attentiveness naturally turned ordinary moments into entertainment. In Victorian homes, evenings often centered around a single room. Families gathered close to conserve heat and light. This physical closeness encouraged emotional connection. Stories were shared, arguments unfolded, lessons were passed down. Elders spoke, children listened. Knowledge moved through voice and memory, not digital archives. Without electricity, people experienced the full weight of time passing. Long winter nights felt truly long. Summer evenings were cherished for their extended daylight. Seasonal change mattered deeply because it altered daily life. Entertainment adjusted accordingly. More indoor activities in winter, more outdoor socializing in summer. Life moved in cycles, not algorithms. The lack of artificial light also meant sleep followed a natural rhythm. People went to bed earlier and rose earlier. Dreams were longer, nights quieter. This affected mental life in subtle ways. With fewer distractions, thoughts lingered. Reflection was unavoidable. In this mental stillness, creativity and introspection thrived. Public life mirrored this slower pace. Streets were darker, quieter, and more intimate. A single performer could draw a crowd because there were fewer competing stimuli. A speech, a song, or a spectacle commanded attention fully. When something happened, people noticed. The Victorian world demanded engagement. You could not sit back and be entertained passively for hours. To enjoy yourself, you had to participate, to speak, to listen, to play, to imagine. Fun was something you helped create, not something delivered to you. This absence of electricity shaped emotional resilience. People learned how to sit with discomfort, how to endure silence, how to wait. These skills softened boredom and sharpened appreciation. When joy arrived, it felt earned. When laughter erupted, it carried relief. There was also a shared understanding of limits. Night ended activity. Darkness imposed boundaries. These limits gave structure to life and meaning to moments within it. Entertainment did not bleed endlessly into every hour. It had a beginning and an end. In many ways, the Victorian relationship with fun was more conscious than our own. They knew when entertainment began, because it contrasted sharply with work. They knew when it ended, because darkness and fatigue demanded rest. This clarity made leisure feel precious. Without switches or screens, Victorians built a world where fun depended on human presence. It lived in voices, gestures, shared spaces, and collective attention. Their enjoyment was slower, quieter, and more fragile, but also more intimate. In stepping into their world, we glimpse a way of living where time was not constantly consumed, but experienced, where night was not conquered, but accepted, and where fun, stripped of electricity, revealed its most human form. Step into a Victorian music hall on a crowded evening in 1850, and the first thing that strikes you is not the performance, but the noise. The room is alive long before anyone steps onto the stage. Wooden benches creak under the weight of working men and women fresh from long hours of labor. Tankards clink, conversations overlap. Laughter erupts without warning. This is not a quiet, respectful audience waiting patiently in the dark. This is a living, breathing crowd, fully involved before the show has even begun. Music halls were not built for silence, they were built for release. For many Victorians, especially those of the working class, these venues were the only place where social rules loosened their grip. Inside, people could laugh loudly, shout their approval, or mock a bad performance without fear of judgment. Entertainment here was raw, immediate, and deeply personal. The performers understood this. A music hall artist did not simply perform at the audience, they performed with them. Comic singers delivered exaggerated songs about everyday struggles, difficult landlords, overbearing bosses, nagging spouses, and the absurdities of urban life. These were not distant fantasies. They were reflections of the audience's own experiences, turned into humor. When people laughed, they were laughing at themselves, at their hardships, at a world that rarely gave them control. Unlike modern entertainment, there was no barrier between performer and spectator. A singer might pause mid-song to respond to a heckle. A comedian could change their routine based on the mood of the crowd. If the audience grew restless, the performance shifted. Entertainment was flexible, alive, and unpredictable. The music itself was simple but powerful. Catchy melodies made it easy for audiences to sing along, and they often did. Entire halls echoed with voices, imperfect and loud, blending into a collective sound that erased individuality for a moment. In those moments, class, stress, and fatigue faded. What remained was shared emotion. Music halls also served as spaces of subtle rebellion. Satirical songs mocked authority, poked fun at politicians, and exposed social hypocrisy. This humor was rarely polite. It was sharp, ironic, and sometimes cruel, but it gave people a voice in a society where many felt unheard. Laughter became a form of power. For those who could afford a different kind of escape, theaters and opera houses offered contrast rather than competition. These venues were quieter, more controlled, and steeped in ritual. Attending the theater was not just about watching a performance, it was about being seen. Clothing mattered. Posture mattered. Behavior mattered. Gas lamps illuminated ornate interiors, casting a soft glow over velvet curtains, gold trim, and painted ceilings. The air smelled of perfume, wax, and warm fabric. Every detail reinforced the sense that this was a special place, separate from ordinary life. The performances themselves carried weight because they existed only in that moment. There were no recordings, no replays, no reviews instantly accessible the next day. What happened on that stage lived only in memory. This made each performance precious. A missed show was truly missed forever. Actors were admired not just for their talent but for their endurance. Performing night after night under hot lights, projecting their voices without microphones, demanded physical strength. A mistake could not be edited out. A forgotten line had to be recovered in real time. Audiences respected this vulnerability, even when they judged it harshly. Opera, in particular, offered emotional intensity unmatched by any other art form of the time. Live orchestras filled large halls with sound that vibrated through the body. Voices rose without amplification, carrying grief, joy, love, and despair across the room. For many Victorians, this was the most powerful emotional experience available to them. Theater also served as a moral mirror. Plays explored themes of loyalty, betrayal, ambition, and social duty. Audiences did not simply watch these stories, they interpreted them as lessons. Entertainment and morality were closely linked. A play could entertain while reinforcing social values or quietly challenging them. Class divisions were visible even within these spaces. Seating arrangements reflected social hierarchy. The wealthy enjoyed private boxes with the best views, while poorer patrons crowded into galleries. Yet despite these divisions, everyone watched the same stage. For a few hours, attention was unified. Outside major cities, traveling theater troupes brought performances to towns that rarely saw such spectacle. Their arrival was an event. Posters appeared, excitement built, and anticipation spread. When the performance finally came, it broke the monotony of daily life, offering stories larger than the world people knew. Music halls and theaters also shaped identity. Catchphrases from popular songs entered everyday language. Famous performers became early celebrities, recognized in the streets and discussed in newspapers. People followed careers, argued over favorites, and built personal taste around entertainment. This communal aspect cannot be overstated. Victorians did not experience entertainment alone. They experienced it together, reacting collectively, remembering collectively. A good performance became a shared memory, retold and exaggerated over time. The absence of electricity heightened this experience. Gaslight flickered unpredictably, shadows moved, sounds carried differently. There was an intimacy to these spaces that modern venues rarely replicate. The audience could see the sweat on a performer's face, hear the strain in their voice. Nothing was hidden. Mistakes were part of the magic. A broken string, a missed cue, a cracked note. These moments reminded audiences that what they were witnessing was human effort, not mechanical perfection. This imperfection created connection. Entertainment in 1850 demanded attention. You could not half watch a performance while distracted by something else. If you were there, you were present. Your reaction mattered. Your laughter fed the room. Your silence shifted the mood. In a society shaped by strict social expectations, these spaces allowed controlled chaos. Emotion was permitted, even encouraged. People could feel deeply without explanation. For a few hours, life loosened its grip. When the performance ended and the crowd spilled back into dark streets, something lingered. A song hummed under breath. A joke replayed in the mind. The memory of shared laughter softened the return to routine. Music halls and theaters were more than entertainment. They were emotional outlets, social forums, and cultural engines. They reflected Victorian life while offering escape from it. Without electricity, without recorded sound, without screens, these spaces relied entirely on human presence and participation, and in doing so, they created experiences that were fleeting, intense, and unforgettable. In that flickering light, surrounded by voices and movement, Victorians found something essential. Not just amusement, but connection. Step outside a Victorian home in 1850, and you step into a world where the street itself is alive with possibility. Long before radios, televisions, or cinemas, the street was a shared stage, a place where entertainment appeared without warning and disappeared just as suddenly. Life unfolded in public view, and people learned to watch, listen, and gather instinctively. A raised voice, a small crowd, or an unusual sound was enough to draw attention. Curiosity was a powerful force, and it often led to amusement. Victorian streets were busy, layered spaces. Horses pulled carts over cobblestones, vendors shouted their wares, children ran between adults, and neighbors exchanged news at doorways. In this constant movement, entertainment did not announce itself formally. It emerged naturally from everyday life. A man stopping to sing, a woman telling a story, a child performing tricks, all could transform an ordinary street corner into a temporary theater. Street performers, known today as buskers, were an essential part of urban entertainment. They were musicians, storytellers, magicians, puppeteers, acrobats, and illusionists. Some were highly skilled professionals, others were amateurs hoping to earn a few coins. What united them was their reliance on human attention alone. There were no microphones, no stages, no special effects. Everything depended on voice, gesture, timing, and the ability to hold a crowd. A good street performer understood people. They knew how to build anticipation, when to pause, when to exaggerate, and when to invite laughter. Performances were interactive by necessity. Audiences stood close, often forming tight circles. Children sat on the ground. Adults leaned in. Reactions were immediate and unfiltered. If something was funny, people laughed loudly. If it was dull, they drifted away without apology. Puppet shows were especially popular with children, though adults watched just as closely. These performances often retold familiar stories or created exaggerated versions of everyday life. Puppets argued, tricked one another, and defied authority in ways people could not. Through these small wooden figures, social tensions were explored safely, humorously, and without consequence. Storytellers held a different kind of power. With nothing more than words and expression, they could transport listeners to distant lands or imagined pasts. Many told tales of adventure, crime, romance, or moral struggle. Stories were dramatic, filled with suspense and vivid detail. Voices rose and fell, hands gestured wildly, and faces shifted to embody different characters. The audience supplied the rest with imagination. In a society where literacy was growing but not universal, spoken stories were vital. They preserved history, reinforced cultural values, and entertained simultaneously. People remembered stories because they were meant to be remembered. Without written copies or recordings, repetition ensured survival. The best tales were told again and again, changing slightly each time, shaped by the teller and the audience. Street entertainment also included trained animals. Dogs performed tricks, monkeys wore costumes, and bears were sometimes led through towns by handlers. These displays drew large crowds, though they also sparked moral debate even then. Still, for many Victorians, such performances were rare glimpses of novelty, offering fascination in a world where daily life was predictable and constrained. Markets were another center of spectacle. Beyond buying and selling, markets were social events. Vendors competed not just with goods, but with personality. Clever jokes, exaggerated claims, and playful insults entertained shoppers. A skilled vendor could draw crowds simply by speaking well. Shopping became a form of amusement. Public speeches and demonstrations added another layer. Political speakers, reformers, and religious figures addressed crowds in open spaces. These gatherings blurred the line between education and entertainment. Passionate delivery, dramatic pauses, and emotional appeals kept audiences engaged. People came not only to learn, but to feel part of something larger. Even conflict became spectacle. Arguments in the street attracted onlookers. Disputes were watched, commented on, and sometimes encouraged. In a world with fewer distractions, human drama commanded attention. Observation itself became entertainment. Children experienced the street differently. For them, it was a playground and classroom combined. They played games, invented rules, and watched adults closely. Street life taught them social skills, humor, negotiation, and resilience. Entertainment was not provided, it was created. Rural areas had their own versions of public amusement. Village greens hosted gatherings, games, and celebrations. Traveling performers moved from town to town, bringing news, novelty, and excitement. Their arrival disrupted routine and sparked anticipation. People gathered because there was nothing else like it. Seasonal events intensified street entertainment. Holidays, fairs, and public celebrations transformed familiar spaces. Decorations appeared. Music filled the air. Temporary stages were built. For a short time, ordinary rules loosened. People dressed differently, behaved differently, and allowed themselves joy more freely. These events mattered deeply because they were rare. Without constant stimulation, novelty had power. A single performance could be remembered for years. Children recalled it into adulthood. Adults compared it to others they had seen, debating quality and meaning. Street entertainment also reflected social inequality. Wealthier citizens could choose indoor amusements, but street performances were accessible to nearly everyone. They crossed class boundaries. A laborer and a shopkeeper might stand side by side, equally absorbed. In these moments, hierarchy softened. The lack of electricity heightened sensory awareness. Sounds carried farther in quieter streets. Flickering gas lamps cast long shadows, adding drama to evening performances. Darkness gathered at the edges, making light and movement more striking. Performers used this atmosphere instinctively. There was also risk. Crowds could grow restless. Performers were vulnerable to theft, mockery, or interference. Success required courage and adaptability, yet many returned day after day, driven by necessity and by the human need to be seen and heard. Street life demanded attention. You could not scroll past it, you either watched or walked away. Presence was unavoidable. This created a different relationship with entertainment, one rooted in immediacy rather than convenience. Public amusement also encouraged storytelling after the fact. People described what they had seen to friends and family. Details grew richer in retelling. Memory became part of the entertainment itself. A performance did not end when the crowd dispersed, it lived on in conversation. In a world without electricity, streets were not just pathways, they were social spaces. They connected people not only physically, but emotionally. Entertainment emerged from human interaction rather than technology. Victorian street life reminds us that amusement does not require complexity. It requires attention, imagination, and a willingness to gather. When people slow down and look at one another, entertainment finds them. In those crowded streets, under gaslight and open sky, Victorians discovered joy in watching life unfold. They did not need screens to distract them. They needed only each other, a moment, and the courage to stop and look. As daylight faded and the streets outside grew quieter, Victorian homes came alive in their own distinct way. Without electric light to stretch the day endlessly, evenings became intimate, enclosed moments shaped by candle flame and closeness. Families gathered not because they were bored, but because there was nowhere else to retreat. The home was not a backdrop to entertainment, it was the center of it. The physical arrangement of Victorian houses encouraged this togetherness. In many homes, especially among the working and middle classes, there was one main living space where heat and light were concentrated. Candles were expensive, fireplaces demanded fuel, and so people naturally clustered together. Chairs were pulled close. Shadows moved gently across the walls. The room felt smaller, warmer, and more human. Conversation was the foundation of these evenings. Without outside noise or electronic interruption, voices filled the space fully. Discussions were unhurried. People told stories about their day, debated ideas, shared rumors, and reflected on events both personal and public. Silence was not uncomfortable, it was thoughtful. A pause meant someone was considering their words, not avoiding them. Victorians believed conversation was a skill, something to be cultivated. Children were taught how to speak properly, how to listen, and how to contribute respectfully. Wit was admired, memory was exercised. The ability to tell a good story or make others laugh carried social value. In a world without instant entertainment, personality mattered. Parlor games emerged naturally from this environment. These were not distractions designed to occupy the mind passively. They required creativity, observation, and participation. Charades, for example, turned the body into a storytelling tool. Players acted out words or phrases through movement alone, while others guessed. Laughter came not from polish, but from exaggeration, misunderstanding, and shared embarrassment. Word games sharpened intelligence and memory. Riddles, puzzles, and guessing games circulated widely. These activities reflected a society that valued mental agility. Entertainment was expected to improve you, not merely amuse you. Even games carried an educational edge. Music played a central role in home entertainment. In many middle-class households, the piano was the most important piece of furniture after the dining table. Learning to play was not optional, it was a marker of refinement. Children practiced diligently, and evening performances were common. Music was not background noise, it demanded attention. When someone played, others listened closely. There were no recordings to fall back on. Every note was produced live, every mistake heard. Singing followed naturally. Families sang hymns, folk songs, and popular tunes together. Voices blended imperfectly, but sincerity mattered more than precision. Music connected people emotionally in a way that words sometimes could not. For homes without instruments, music still existed. People sang unaccompanied or used simple tools, tambourines, spoons, or handmade instruments. Rhythm came from clapping or tapping feet. Creativity filled the gaps left by material limits. Reading aloud was another cornerstone of Victorian evenings. Books were precious objects, often shared rather than owned individually. Newspapers, letters, novels, and poems were read to the group. This transformed reading from a solitary act into a communal experience. Serialized novels were especially powerful. Stories released chapter by chapter created anticipation that stretched across weeks or months. Families waited eagerly for the next installment, speculating about plot and characters. When the new chapter arrived, it was an event. The reader's voice carried suspense, emotion, and drama into the room. This shared reading strengthened memory and imagination. Without illustrations or screens, listeners built mental images together. Characters became familiar, almost real. Discussions followed readings about motives, morals, and possible outcomes. Entertainment extended beyond the moment into conversation and reflection. Storytelling also passed through generations. Elders recounted family history, local legends, and personal experiences. These stories preserved identity and continuity. They reminded younger listeners where they came from and what mattered. Entertainment and tradition were inseparable. Crafts and handiwork filled quieter moments. Knitting, sewing, carving, and repairing objects were done in company. Hands stayed busy while minds engaged in conversation. Productivity and leisure overlapped. Making something useful did not cancel enjoyment, it enhanced it. Games of observation and memory reflected the Victorian respect for discipline. Even fun was structured. Rules mattered. Fair play mattered. Learning how to lose gracefully was part of moral education. Entertainment shaped character. The absence of electricity also influenced emotional life. Candlelight softened expressions. Faces appeared warmer, more expressive. The pace of life slowed naturally. There was time to notice subtle shifts in mood, small changes in voice. Emotional intelligence developed through constant interpersonal contact. Victorian homes were not always harmonious. Arguments occurred, tension surfaced. But these conflicts were confronted directly, not avoided through distraction. Entertainment did not numb emotion, it coexisted with it. People learned to manage relationships because they could not escape them easily. Weather intensified home life. Long winter nights pushed families indoors for extended periods. These stretches demanded creativity. New games were invented. Stories were retold with variation. Repetition did not dull enjoyment, it deepened familiarity and comfort. Social visits were frequent. Neighbors dropped by without advance notice. Hospitality was expected. Evenings expanded as guests arrived. Chairs were rearranged. Games grew louder. Laughter filled rooms. Entertainment adapted organically to the number of people present. These gatherings reinforced community bonds. Everyone contributed something, a song, a story, a skill. Entertainment was not centralized. It was distributed among participants. This created a sense of belonging and responsibility. Children learned by watching. They absorbed social cues, humor, and language naturally. They learned patience by waiting their turn. They learned empathy by observing others. Home entertainment functioned as informal education. In wealthier households, evenings could include more elaborate amusements, private concerts, readings, or structured games. But even here, electricity's absence shaped experience. Light remained limited. Attention remained focused. Presence remained essential. Time moved differently indoors. Without glowing clocks or screens, people lost track of minutes. Evenings ended not when entertainment ran out, but when fatigue set in. The body, not technology, determined rest. Sleep followed naturally. Minds tired from conversation, music, and thoughts settled into rest. Dreams carried impressions from shared experiences. Night felt complete, not interrupted. Victorian home entertainment reveals something easily forgotten. Joy does not require abundance. It requires connection. When people gather with intention, creativity fills the space. In these candlelit rooms, fun was not loud or constant. It was layered, intimate, and human. Without electricity, Victorians learned how to be present with one another, fully, imperfectly, and sincerely. When Victorians stepped beyond the walls of their homes, leisure transformed into something almost ceremonial. Outdoor enjoyment was not casual or accidental. It was planned, anticipated, and shaped by social custom. In 1850, going outside for pleasure meant entering shared spaces where seeing and being seen mattered just as much as the activity itself. Public enjoyment carried meaning, identity, and status. Public parks became some of the most important leisure spaces of the Victorian era. As cities expanded and industrial life grew harsher, parks were deliberately designed as places of moral and physical restoration. They were not wild landscapes but carefully ordered environments, trimmed lawns, winding paths, flower beds arranged with intention. Nature was shaped to be calm, controlled, and respectable. Walking through a park was not simply exercise, it was a social ritual. People dressed carefully, even for something as simple as a stroll. Clothing signaled respectability, class, and self-discipline. A walk was slow and deliberate. Rushing would have seemed improper. Conversation flowed quietly, punctuated by pauses to observe others passing by. Benches were placed strategically, inviting people to sit, watch, and reflect. Watching strangers became a form of entertainment. Couples, families, workers on brief respite, all became part of a moving tableau. People observed fashion, behavior, posture, and interaction. In an age without screens, the human world provided endless material. Parks also allowed for controlled freedom. Children could run more openly than in narrow streets. Young couples could walk together under public supervision, balancing romance with propriety. Elderly visitors enjoyed the sense of participation in communal life. These spaces offered relief from crowded housing without threatening social order. Pleasure gardens took this idea further. These were places explicitly designed for amusement. Music played from bandstands. Lanterns glowed at dusk. Food and drink were available. Fireworks lit the sky on special occasions. These gardens blended nature with spectacle, creating environments where leisure felt magical yet respectable. Evenings in pleasure gardens were especially popular. As daylight softened and gas lamps flickered on, the atmosphere shifted, shadows lengthened, music drifted through the air, and conversations became more relaxed. People lingered, knowing the experience was temporary. Darkness would eventually send everyone home. These outings were rarely spontaneous. Families planned them carefully, saving money and choosing the right day. Anticipation was part of the enjoyment. Children waited eagerly. Adults discussed details in advance. When the day finally arrived, it carried emotional weight. For the working class, fairs and festivals were among the most powerful forms of entertainment. These events broke the rhythm of labor and routine. Traveling fairs arrived with noise, color, and energy, transforming familiar spaces into places of excitement. Temporary structures rose quickly, rides, stalls, stages, and disappeared just as fast. Fairs offered sensations unavailable in daily life. Loud music, fast movement, unusual foods, and crowds created an intensity that contrasted sharply with disciplined work environments. Games of chance tempted participants with risk and reward. Even losing carried thrill. For a moment the rules of ordinary life loosened. Food played an important role in these experiences. Sweets, roasted meats, and treats rarely available at home became symbols of celebration. Eating itself became entertainment, tied to memory and pleasure rather than necessity. Sports also drew crowds and shaped public leisure. Cricket matches could last hours or even days, offering extended communal engagement. Spectators followed the action closely, debating decisions and celebrating skill. The slow pace allowed conversation and social bonding alongside observation. Rowing competitions, boxing matches, and horse racing attracted diverse audiences. These events combined physical spectacle with emotional investment. Cheering, arguing, and betting intensified engagement. Victory and defeat were shared experiences. Horse racing in particular blended entertainment with social hierarchy. Different classes occupied different areas, yet all focused on the same race. The thrill of speed and uncertainty cut across social divisions, even if briefly. Public celebrations marked national and religious occasions. Parades, ceremonies, and gatherings brought communities together. Decorations appeared on buildings. Bells rang. Music filled streets. These events reinforced collective identity and shared history. Seasonal change shaped leisure profoundly. Summer extended opportunities for outdoor enjoyment, while winter limited them. This made warm weather events feel precious. Long daylight hours encouraged extended walks, picnics, and gatherings. People lingered outdoors, aware that the season would pass. Even simple outings carried emotional significance. A family picnic involved preparation, travel, and coordination. Blankets, food, and time were invested. The experience felt earned. Memories formed around these moments because they stood apart from routine. Public spaces also served educational and moral purposes. Museums, exhibitions, and lectures offered learning alongside enjoyment. These venues reinforced Victorian values of self-improvement. Entertainment was expected to elevate as well as amuse. Music in public spaces united strangers. Band performances drew listeners together, creating temporary communities. People stood side by side, sharing sound and mood. Applause rippled through crowds, reinforcing collective response. Even watching others enjoy themselves became entertainment. Children laughing, couples walking, musicians playing. These sights created a sense of life unfolding. Presence itself was satisfying. The absence of electricity shaped all of this. Events ended naturally as darkness deepened. Artificial light existed, but it was limited. This gave leisure a clear boundary. Knowing it would end made people savor it more fully. There was also vulnerability in public leisure. Weather could ruin plans, crowds could disappoint, performances could fail. Yet these uncertainties added intensity. When things went well, joy felt greater. Public leisure required cooperation. Shared spaces demanded shared behavior. People learned patience, tolerance, and awareness of others. Fun was collective, not individualized. In these parks, gardens, fairs, and sporting grounds, Victorians experienced freedom within structure. Entertainment was woven into community life, rather than isolated consumption. Without electricity, leisure remained grounded in time, place, and human presence. It was shaped by seasons, daylight, and social rhythm. Joy arrived through participation, not convenience. Public enjoyment reminded Victorians that they belonged to something larger than themselves. In stepping outside together, they affirmed connection, tradition, and shared humanity. These moments of outdoor pleasure did not erase hardship, but they softened it. They provided contrast, relief, and memory. And in a world moving toward modernity, they preserved something essential: the ability to enjoy life slowly, together, under open sky. When the lights dimmed naturally and the day came to its quiet close, Victorians did not feel deprived. They felt complete. Entertainment had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when it ended, it left space behind, space for rest, thought, and memory. This rhythm shaped how people understood enjoyment itself. Fun was not endless, it was meaningful because it was finite. Without electricity, leisure was framed by natural limits. Darkness was not an inconvenience to be defeated, but a signal to slow down. When the night deepened, activity softened, voices lowered, streets emptied, homes grew still. This enforced pause created balance. Entertainment did not bleed into exhaustion, it concluded with dignity. Victorians understood anticipation in a way modern life rarely allows. Because amusement was not instantly available, people looked forward to it. They planned for it mentally and emotionally. The waiting itself became part of the pleasure. A fair weeks away, a performance announced in advance, a visit promised on a certain evening. All of these lived in the mind long before they occurred. Anticipation sharpened attention and deepened satisfaction. Memory carried greater weight in a world without recordings. Experiences lived on only if they were remembered and retold. This made people more present in the moment. You listened carefully because there would be no replay. You watched closely because you might never see it again. Entertainment imprinted itself on the mind, not on a device. Shared memory strengthened bonds. People who attended the same event referenced it later, laughed about it, argued about it, embellished it. Stories grew richer with retelling. What began as entertainment became part of personal and communal history. In this way, fun extended far beyond the moment itself. Victorian leisure was inseparable from effort. Getting dressed, traveling, preparing food, arranging time, these acts required energy. That effort invested value into the experience. When something costs effort, it feels earned. When it feels earned, it is respected. Modern entertainment often removes effort entirely. Victorian entertainment demanded it, and because of that, it rarely felt empty. Even simple pleasures carried meaning because they existed in contrast to labor, silence, and waiting. Presence was unavoidable. You could not half attend an experience while mentally elsewhere. There were no parallel distractions. Attention belonged to the room, the street, the crowd. This focus intensified emotion. Laughter was fuller. Silence was deeper. Disappointment was sharper. Joy felt real because it was undiluted. Victorians learned how to sit with themselves. Long evenings without stimulation forced reflection. Thoughts wandered. Emotions surfaced. Imagination filled the gaps. This inner life shaped creativity, philosophy, and self-awareness. Entertainment did not drown out thought, it coexisted with it. Community mattered more because it had to. Isolation was uncomfortable without distractions. People sought company not out of habit but necessity. This encouraged social skill, tolerance, and empathy. You learned how to engage, how to listen, how to compromise. Entertainment trained social intelligence. Even conflict had space to resolve. Disagreements could not be ignored indefinitely. Without escape into private screens, issues surfaced and were addressed. This made relationships more demanding, but also more resilient. Victorian fun reminds us that enjoyment is not about quantity. It is about depth. A single evening could leave a lasting impression because it was fully experienced. Entertainment did not compete endlessly for attention. It occupied it completely for a time and then stepped aside. There was also humility in Victorian leisure. Nature, weather, and daylight could not be controlled. Plans adapted to conditions. This taught acceptance. When rain ruined an outing, disappointment was shared, discussed, and eventually accepted. Resilience grew from these moments. The limits imposed by darkness created sacred boundaries. Rest was respected. Sleep was not postponed endlessly. Minds and bodies recovered. This balance supported emotional stability in subtle ways. Victorian enjoyment also reflected values. Entertainment was expected to shape character, reinforce community, and provide moral reflection. Even when playful or chaotic, it existed within a framework of meaning. Fun was not separate from life. It was part of it. This does not mean Victorian life was easier or happier. It was often harder, more restrictive, and more exhausting. But precisely because of this, moments of joy mattered more. They stood out against struggle. They reminded people why endurance mattered. In stepping back from electricity, we see how deeply technology shapes perception. Artificial light erased natural endings. Endless access dissolved anticipation. Convenience softened memory. None of this is inherently wrong, but something was exchanged. Victorian leisure teaches us that entertainment does not need to be constant to be fulfilling. It needs to be intentional. It needs boundaries. It needs presence. Their world moved slower, not because it lacked innovation, but because it honored rhythm. Day led to night. Work led to rest. Silence followed sound. This cycle gave meaning to each part. In their candlelit rooms and crowded streets, Victorians found joy not by escaping reality, but by engaging with it. They laughed with others, not alone. They watched life unfold rather than scrolling past it. What they understood, perhaps without naming it, is that fun is a human creation. It lives in attention, effort, and connection. Strip away electricity, and what remains is not emptiness, but each other. And in remembering how they lived, we are reminded that enjoyment is not something we download or switch on. It is something we choose to enter, fully, while it lasts. When the night finally fell silent and the last candle burned low, Victorian fun did not vanish. It settled into memory, into conversation, into identity. And in that quiet ending, there was completeness, not loss. In a world without electricity, they learned when to stop, and in stopping, they learned how to truly enjoy what had been. As the 1850s unfolded, the Victorian world lingered on a delicate edge, a world still dominated by human presence, natural light, and deliberate shared enjoyment. These were the last years before rapid industrialization, before the hum of electricity and the clamor of modern convenience began to reshape daily life. In these fleeting moments, fun carried a different weight. It was intentional, tactile, and deeply human. Even as evenings ended with the dying glow of candles and gas lamps, the memories of laughter, music, and storytelling remained vivid. People savored these experiences not because they were rare spectacles, but because every act of entertainment demanded attention, preparation, and emotional investment. To sit together for a parlor game, to watch children perform in the streets, or to stroll through a park or fair was to participate fully in life itself. It was not something passively consumed. It was something co-created, fragile and fleeting, yet intensely meaningful. These final moments of pre-electric leisure carried lessons that are almost invisible to us today. Time itself was a companion. Hours passed slowly yet deliberately, giving people the space to notice small details, the rustle of leaves in a park, the flicker of candlelight on a polished table, the rhythm of voices rising and falling in song or conversation. Even silence became part of entertainment, a pause to reflect, imagine, or simply be with one another. Life without electricity forced people to inhabit their own minds and bodies more fully. They learned patience, imagination, empathy, and the subtle art of presence, skills that modern devices often erode. It was a world in which anticipation mattered more than instant gratification. Children waited eagerly for the next chapter of a serialized novel. Families looked forward to outings to fairs or pleasure gardens. Even the simple act of planning an evening at home carried weight, from preparing candles and arranging seats to selecting games, music, or readings. Every detail, no matter how small, became part of the enjoyment. Fun was woven into effort, and effort gave it significance. But change was already on the horizon. Railways were connecting cities faster than ever. Factories reshaped work and routine. The hum of industry crept into towns and neighborhoods. And though electricity had not yet arrived in most homes, it was only a matter of time before the rhythms of life that Victorians had mastered, anticipation, presence, patience, and shared attention, would be challenged. Entertainment would become faster, more portable, and increasingly detached from human effort. This was a threshold moment. It was a world still grounded in natural light and human interaction, yet aware that the landscape of leisure was about to shift irrevocably. In these last moments of simplicity, Victorian fun was not just amusement. It was a statement of human resilience, creativity, and the enduring power connection. To witness it now is to see the value of slowing down, of experiencing rather than consuming, and of understanding that joy is often measured not by quantity, but by presence. The laughter in a music hall, the storytelling in a parlor, the songs echoing through parks and streets, all of it reminds us that entertainment once required patience, attention, and shared humanity. And as we linger here between the end of Part 6 and the approaching wave of modernization, we can pause to appreciate what is about to be lost, and what it taught the Victorians, and through them, what it can teach us today. In the decades that followed 1850, the Victorian world slowly began to change. New inventions crept in quietly at first, almost unnoticed. Gaslighting improved, machines grew louder, cities expanded, and time itself seemed to accelerate. Yet before electricity fully transformed daily life, there existed a fragile moment, a threshold between old rhythms and modern speed. Part of what makes Victorian fun so fascinating is that it existed on this edge, balanced between tradition and transformation. Victorians were not unaware that their world was shifting. Railways shortened distances, factories reshaped labor, newspapers spread information faster than ever before. But despite these changes, entertainment still relied overwhelmingly on human presence. Machines could move goods and people, but they could not yet replace laughter, storytelling, music, or shared attention. Fun remained stubbornly human. This created a tension unique to the era. On one hand, life was becoming more crowded, regulated, and demanding. On the other, leisure became more intentional, almost defensive. Victorians clung to rituals of enjoyment because those rituals preserved something essential: control over time, meaning, and connection. Entertainment was one of the few areas where people could assert individuality within a rigid social structure. Choosing how to spend one's leisure hours mattered. Whether someone preferred music halls, quiet reading, park walks, or home gatherings said something about who they were. Fun became a subtle form of identity. This identity was shaped not by algorithms, but by habit and community. People followed traditions passed down through families and neighborhoods. Leisure patterns repeated across generations. A child who grew up attending fairs or listening to stories often carried those preferences into adulthood. Entertainment became part of personal history. Victorians also understood loss more intimately than many modern societies. Disease, poverty, and early death were common. This awareness sharpened appreciation. Moments of joy were fragile, temporary, and therefore cherished. Fun was not trivial. It was restorative. This awareness of fragility influenced how people behaved during leisure. There was an unspoken seriousness beneath the laughter. Joy was not careless, it was intentional. Even exuberant celebrations carried undertones of gratitude and relief. Victorian entertainment also fostered resilience. When joy depended on people rather than technology, it could survive scarcity. A song required only a voice, a game required only imagination, a story required only memory. Even in hardship, these things endured. This resilience became especially visible during times of crisis. Economic downturns, harsh winters, or social unrest did not erase entertainment. They transformed it. People adapted, simplifying pleasures rather than abandoning them. This adaptability preserved morale. Another striking aspect of Victorian fun was its moral dimension. Leisure was constantly evaluated by families, churches, and society at large. Fun was acceptable only if it aligned with certain values. This constraint may seem limiting, but it also gave entertainment weight. Activities were chosen carefully because they reflected character. Even rebellion occurred within these boundaries. Satire, humor, and parody allowed people to challenge authority indirectly. Laughter became a safe release valve. Entertainment expressed dissatisfaction without open confrontation. The absence of electricity preserved this balance. Technology had not yet overwhelmed social norms. Entertainment remained embedded within human relationships rather than detached from them. As the century progressed, electricity began to erode these boundaries. Artificial light extended nights. Recorded sound detached music from musicians. Screens gradually replaced gatherings. Fun became portable, repeatable, and solitary. Looking back, Victorian leisure reveals what is often lost when convenience increases. The friction that once made joy meaningful disappears. Anticipation fades. Memory weakens. Presence fractures. This is not nostalgia, it is observation. The Victorians did not live better lives overall. They lived harder ones. But within that hardness, their moments of enjoyment carried density. They were thick with attention, emotion, and human contact. Victorian fun reminds us that boredom is not an enemy, it is a doorway. When stimulation disappears, imagination awakens. When silence returns, thought deepens. When time slows, meaning accumulates. The Victorian world teaches that entertainment is not a product, it is a process. It unfolds through effort, cooperation, and time. It cannot be fully automated without losing something essential. Their evenings ended naturally, not because content ran out, but because energy did. Rest followed satisfaction. Sleep followed completion. There was closure. Modern life rarely offers this closure. Entertainment loops endlessly. Nights blur into mornings. Satisfaction becomes elusive because endings disappear. Victorians understood endings. They accepted them. And because of that, beginnings felt special. Their world, lit by candle and gaslight, held darkness at the edges. But that darkness did not diminish joy. It framed it. Light mattered because it was limited. Sound mattered because silence surrounded it. Company mattered because solitude was real. In studying how Victorians had fun without electricity, we are not merely observing history. We are confronting a question: what makes enjoyment meaningful? Is it abundance or attention? Is it convenience or presence? Is it endless choice or shared experience? Victorian life suggests that joy emerges not from removing limits, but from living within them fully. Their laughter echoed louder because it was not constant. Their stories endured because they were remembered, not stored. Their gatherings mattered because they required effort. In the end, Victorian fun was not about escaping life, it was about inhabiting it, fully, collectively, and with awareness. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson they leave behind, that joy does not need electricity to exist. It needs time, people, and the willingness to be there when it happens. When we strip entertainment down to its core, we find what they found: human connection, shared attention, and moments that end, but never truly disappear. And so, our journey back to 1850 comes to an end. We have walked the gaslit streets, joined families in candlelit rooms, and felt the anticipation, effort, and presence that shaped Victorian fun. In a world without electricity, they discovered something we often forget today, that true enjoyment is earned, shared, and savored. Their laughter, their stories, their music, they remind us that joy is not about convenience or endless choice. It is about connection, attention, and being fully present in the moment. As we return to our own modern world, perhaps we can take a page from their lives, to slow down, to notice one another, and to find pleasure not in what lights up a screen, but in what lights up our hearts. Thank you for drifting back in time with us. Until our next journey, may your moments of joy be intentional, shared, and unforgettable.